So first of all, a big thanks, Josh, for joining us on this sort of this series of EdTech leaders sort of interviews. I was actually really keen to get you on board, mainly because I think you've got quite a wide understanding of lots of things that are happening in the EdTech market, and not fixated on one thing. And I think part of that is to do with that you're a bit of a serial entrepreneur, I would say. You seem to get involved. You seem to get involved in lots of different things, and obviously you're starting new businesses at the moment as well. So that's
can't help myself. I keep starting things, Nick.
And you seem to finish them as well. So I appreciate you sold Assembly, to Community Brands. Or was it actually to Group Call?
No, you're right. I should explain what happened there. So yes, for those that don't know, my previous venture was something called Assembly, which is a schools data platform, actually set up as a non-profit backed by ARC, the big education charity and schools group, and another venture philanthropy organization called Neon. Assembly was started in about 2015, and then in 2019, we, and by we I guess I mean sort of ARC, who were the sort of parent organization, if you like, sold that to Group Call, or at least we started the conversations with Group Call. As those conversations were progressing, Group Call themselves were bought by Community Brands, which is a large US sort of private equity backed conglomerate, mostly in education. There were in other areas as well. So yes, that was the sale at the start of 2019. And I had a happy year sort of working within that structure before leaving at the end of last year.
So just give us a bit of a sense of, so obviously you identified a gap in any solutions. I'm assuming probably all the MI solutions in some ways to actually go down this particular route. So how did it start? How do you get to the point of going, actually, I need to go and do something about this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the reason why I mentioned at the beginning that we set up Assembly as a non-profit was partly to give props to the many other people and organizations involved, because it very much wasn't just me, but partly because it helps to understand where we started from. And actually, certainly ARC's perspective on where Assembly started from was, the first line of the business plan, and I don't think this is metaphorically, I think like literally was, how do we help schools use data more effectively? I think I remember writing that and then sort of riffing from there. Maybe the best thing to explain how Assembly came about is to sort of describe the problems we saw at the beginning of the world of using Assembly. And I'm going to sort of simplify, but think in quite a macro term. So the first thing was in 2013, 2014, when we started conversations about the thing that became Assembly, it's true to say that most sectors were becoming quite sophisticated in how data could be moved around the sector, either because of central products that disrupted that world. You think of platforms like Salesforce in the CRM world, for example, or because there were, sort of very flexible APIs that people could use to plug different systems together, sort of Zapier type approaches. Lots of integration happening across the sector. I think it's fair to say that really wasn't happening within the world of education, and that was a real frustration to us, because I think at its roots, although it's a really unglamorous problem, that notion of how you get any system talking to any system is actually the sort of it's the glue, right? It's the highways that knit a sector together. And so part of the Assembly business plan was to create that sort of app ecosystem of products talking to each other. And we did that through building a sort of universal API that allowed products to interact and talk to each other. A bit like actually One2 came along around the same time, a little bit after, and did really well in a similar area. And I think both of us in different ways saw ourselves as insurgents in that space. So that was the first problem we were trying to solve. And then a slightly more obvious and tangible product, the second problem was, well, okay, you can have lots of data flowing around and make it more easy for those data sets to interact. But actually, for data to be usable, you need to have great analysis on top of it. And great analysis doesn't just mean pretty graphs. It means making that data, turning that data into insight so that that data is actionable and you can make better decisions off the back of that data. And so the second part of the Assembly business plan, and in the end product sets, was a multi-academy trust analysis tool. And the reason we focused on multi-academy trusts is a sort of, this isn't a product, but it is a bugbear of mine, is, MATS came along and change the sector, but technology to support maths really didn't. And I still think there's a massive deficit in terms of products to support maths. And given that maths are, academies are sort of over 40% of the sector now, the significant majority of secondary schools, that feels like a flaw and a problem. And you find that a lot of products have a math module, but it looks like it was sort of hacked together in a weekend. And indeed, I do know of some sort of quite substantial math modules that literally were hacked together in a weekend, having spoken to the dev teams there. And we sort of turned it on its head and said, look, maths need a more sophisticated thing in terms of data analysis. They're enterprise organizations, particularly larger maths. They might have 6 systems that they want to flow into their way of handling data analysis. And, they might have 40 sites, and those 40 sites might be using more than one MIS and then a different finance system, an HR system, and so on. And we wanted to build an analysis tool that started there rather than one that started with an individual school's need and then sort of was always just really a sticking plaster on a maths need. So that's how Assembly came about.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I agree with that point. I think do you think so maths are effectively a business in some ways, in lots of ways. I know that it's in education, but even education in schools should be perceived as businesses, and they should be using the latest tech to meet particular needs. So basically, do you think all suppliers aren't necessarily okay, let me turn this on its head. Do you think maths are pushing suppliers enough to actually be at the latest edge of technology and looking at the trends going forward and seeing how those trends can be adapted to meet the maths and the school's needs enough?
Yeah, so the way I would answer that is to say, I sometimes, in my vanishingly thin spare time, but I do bits of advisory work across the sector. And oftentimes I'm asked to look at this question of how maths and vendors engage with each other on education technology. And I would say that there's work to be done on both sides. The first thing I think one needs to understand when addressing this question is that maths are incredibly new, right? I was lucky enough to join ARC as part of the leadership team of the schools group in 2012, right sort of early on, I would say kind of at the start of the Go phase, Cambrian explosion of academization. And it, and ARC was one of the longest standing organizations. So we had this concept of a central team, quite a strong central team. We had some charitable funding early on that meant that the central team, had sort of additional funding beyond what the sort of clawback from the schools was supporting in a way. And so we felt like an organization with central team, still very much supporting schools. I still think the school and the head of that school is the primary thing that drives the school. I still think that's the case, but we at least had a central structure. I would sometimes go and speak to other MATs as they were setting up, and they really wouldn't feel like that. No fault of anyone's case, but if you're 5 schools, your funding's not the same as if you're 25 schools, and if you're 5 primaries, your needs might not be as established. So, this whole notion of what it is to be a MAT is still evolving, and it's still very embryonic. And frankly, some MAT structures, particularly where there are fewer schools, just don't have that much money for that many roles. That notwithstanding, clearly now we're sort of past that explosion phase, which was sometimes a little bit Wild West in terms of what the actual structures would look like. And I think now things are entrenching. And I think MATs are coming up with answers to this question of how you structure a MAT to be effective. And then if we get on this, how do you engage with the sector part of the question, it might be that a MAT actually has an IT director or a procurement manager, or in the world that I work in, a head of assessment or a director of data, or more increasingly a director of insight, say. All of these might be roles where that person's job is to think about this problem. I mean, you might still do your thinking in the shower on weekends, but that's very different from a school where even if you're the assessment lead, you're really busy with so many other things. And actually being the assessment lead means literally running an assessment process in a school at the end of the autumn term. The MAT role can be a bit more expansive and a bit more thought leadership. And I think that's helping MATs to push suppliers. So back to your question, it gives MATs the time, space, and expertise to push suppliers. On the supplier side, there is now just a volume of schools in MATs that you can build business plans starting from a MAT rather than starting from a school and working up to be a MAT. And one great, for example of that, I wrote a blog with him recently. It was a chap called Will Jordan, who used to be at PS Financials themselves, a MAT-facing business, who left last year, set up an amazing sort of quite niche budgeting and financial planning ed tech organization, and their growth has been stellar since then. Last time I spoke to them, they were in the 300s or 400s of schools within a year. Now you'll find very few school-facing startups that grow at that speed, and that's because actually, if you get your niche right working with MATs, then a MAT can buy for 30 schools at once, and your first 30 schools can be really hard to get if you're an ed tech startup. So, the answer to bring it all back together is MATs can and I think need to do more to push suppliers. Suppliers need to be open to it, but actually I think there's still a lot of space for the enthusiastic and savvy startup founder to spot a sort of a space and a gap that is for MATs, and to fill that and almost jump a few steps ahead because they win MATs who have been frustrated with the lack of things that are out there.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. I think identifying a niche and identifying a need as where you can differentiate yourself is exceedingly important. And I think I just find sometimes, I think education itself is quite slow. It feels it's slow at the moment anyway in taking up new technology as much as anything else. Machine learning has been around for donkey's years. There's not that many people now who are still doing, we're entering into machine learning.
No, and I think education will always be slow because there are some very structurally understandable reasons. First of all, funding is low. I think it's a good summary to say that schools have champagne tastes and lemonade prices. And with that problem, it's actually very hard to build a cost-effective solution if you're charging, a tenth of what an equivalent retail product might do, just because your customer doesn't have the money. So, you have that structural problem, which I think limits the evolution of the sector. And then you also just have a market size problem, which is, depending on how you cut it, you might say that there are something like 25,000 schools in England and Wales, but actually that might only be 20,000 schools if you're looking at sort of English state schools, which is a smaller number. And then actually your product might be just secondary, so that might be more like 3,500 schools. And then within that, it might be more the larger, et cetera, et cetera. You see where I'm going with this. So, you might end up with this fundamental problem that you have a great idea, and you could have a great idea and sell it to 1,000 schools, which would be, over 25% of the market. And you might charge $1 or $2 grand per pop, which is, a good normal average price for an edtech piece of software. And you've got a 1 or 2 million turnover business. And, you can sort of sustain a lifestyle business for a small team for that. But actual real investment and growth tends to come at higher business sizes, 5 million turnover, 10 million turnover, 20 million turnover. VCs, private equity firms probably aren't that interested in 1 or 2 million turnover companies. They're sort of trying to look for the 50 million or 100 million, the unicorn. And so just structurally, frankly, it's hard to justify investment in education.
Yeah, that's very true.